This one's from Peter in San Francisco.
There has been criticism of the sexual violence.
Certainly a lot of the scenes in which they are involved are quite heavily sexualized.
In the books and perhaps more so in the show, and they're different.
He writes the sex, nudity, violence, and gore in the HBO series.
What you're saying about the differences between the TV show and the book.
I know the particular controversy you're referring to, which is a scene that played out somewhat differently on screen than it does in the books.
I'm involved in a television show, but it's really run by David Benioff and Dan Weiss.
Of course, there was no pressure on me because I'm hardly involved. I mean, I am basically a consultant.
A lot of interviewers who talk to George R.R. Martin are idiots. Okay, that's unfair, incredibly unkind, and obviously not true. Let me try that again. A lot of people make themselves appear idiot-like because they've clearly never cracked open any of the books they're trying to get this man cancelled over. The A Song of Ice and Fire book series, if you don't know, is what the hit HBO series is based on, taking over the title of the first book, A Game of Thrones. Martin was a co-writer on the show and apparently penned singular episodes up to season 4, but he was obviously not the only mind behind the show and eventually distanced himself even further when it outpaced his source material. And so, every time the old "why is this in Game of Thrones" question comes up, Martin replies, "Game of Thrones? What's that? The series I wrote is called A Song of Ice and Fire. Take it up with the showrunners." And he's not wrong to do that. Some of the most controversial scenes and plot points in Game of Thrones never appear on page. Martin and his most devoted fans have pointed this out over and over again. And because a lot of journalists are determined to just sprint into these cell phones, because a lot of journalists focus more on visual media and don't address the source material, people seem to have arrived at the conclusion that Martin is innocent of these allegations on principle. And that's not surprising, is it? If the interrogation publicly turns out to be completely baseless multiple times, you're just gonna assume it holds no water. The consensus now seems to be that while Asyaf is pretty violent towards women, it's just historical accuracy, and that not liking it is purely a matter of personal taste. Even some of my more progressive guy friends have taken up this rhetoric. I know, the books do deal with some pretty serious adult themes, and if you're too much of a pussy to handle that, don't worry. You don't have to read them. How nice. I'm not gonna deny that some women out there probably don't read Asyaf because of the brutality, and there's no shame in that. I know there's been books I couldn't finish because I got uncomfortable, but discomfort is not the reason these allegations keep coming up. Some of Martin's writing choices are genuinely strange, and to pretend that it's people's sensibility that keeps them from enjoying his books shifts the blame away from him as a writer. It makes it impossible to criticize his work because now the problem is your fragility. So the question we're asking today is, does the A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin include contents that make it deserving of the label misogynistic? And the answer is yeah, pretty much, but also...
Don't tell me your name. I don't need it to love you tonight. Hush. No, don't tell me your name. For one night only we can be in love. Hush. No, don't tell me.
It's really difficult to effectively criticize Martin's portrayal of women. Of course, it's always dangerous to go after a nerdy piece of media with a large, enduring fan base, especially if it's old enough to have crystallized into perfection and people's nostalgia-softened brains. I know for a fact that some of you wouldn't be defending The Final Empire with your whole chests if you'd read it a month ago. He explains it in Well of Ascension. Suck my dick. He should have explained it in the book he ends the plot thread in. Christ alive. Although I can't say that most of the comments I got on that video weren't overwhelmingly productive and polite. That review was meant to only address the first book in the series, but I have to admit that I probably couldn't judge the parts that were set up for the other books as effectively as I might have. I also understand people's allegiance to Brandon Sanderson better now. He seems like a really nice guy, which isn't even something I plan on denying dying Martin. I still think a lot of you are just nostalgic nerds, which is why I'm required to say that yes, I know it's from The Witcher, it's the only one I have at home. It's gonna break my collarbone. But rest assured, I've made a point of picking up and finishing the ACF books out today, which I started and faltered on by the second book a few years ago. I'm aware it's still not the finished body of work that's supposed to make up the story, but let's be real, this is all we're gonna get in the foreseeable future. I also skimmed Fire and Blood and looked at some of the sample chapters for The Winds of Winter. By the time I got to the Duncan Egg stories, I just couldn't be bothered. I've seen both shows, although we will not be considering them as part of our judgment of Martin's writing. When I use them as B-roll, it doesn't mean I'm referring to them, it's just that I don't want to make Foxily sitting here the only visual for this long-ass video. At least not for free. Where was I? Ah yes, whiny nerds. The problem is infinitely amplified with ACF, because as we've established, many people who love the story Martin created haven't actually read it, they're just really invested in the adaptations. So not only are they set on defending the source material, they're also doing it from a context-free how bad can it be point of view. And in order for them to understand how bad it can be, you need to provide context. But that's difficult to do, because context is you pointing out fucked up scenes. Good luck with that at a con panel. Yes, hello, thank you for passing the mic. I was just wondering what inspired you to write the scene of with all over the... Also, many of my arguments have something to do with the frequency at which certain scenes occur, so repetition. I am happy to see you, but that is in fact my annotated pentology in my pants, from which I've selected 20 unspeakable acts to address today. Even in a face-to-face interview, this is hardly possible, if only because of time constraints. And doing it on the internet requires getting around censors that might also not enjoy 20 unspeakable acts being spoken. Somebody think of the advertisers. We must protect the community guidelines, which I'm going to be doing by using the euphemism of nighttime activity for intercourse and related action. Its non-consensual counterpart will be nighttime violence, and in its most severe form, extreme nighttime violence. I'll try to keep these straight and accurate, but obviously I won't be able to elaborate on some details. So I'm going to need you to work with me on this and decode what I'm trying to say. I trust your good faith on this. I want to guarantee now that we're not trying to hunt George R.R. Martin down and burn him at the stake. The aim of this video is to discuss his work in a civil manner together, and to lay out the specifics of the criticism so the eternal miscommunication of what it actually is that bothers people might finally end. Because it's not the inclusion of nighttime violence itself. I have personally read and enjoyed many books that feature it either on page or as a very central theme. This is a craft critique, okay? Okay, for your convenience, I've also included a link to a Google Doc with sections of the books I'm discussing. A designated number in the corner of the screen will direct you to the current section whenever I can't read something out. And that way, even non-readers and people who don't have the books at home will be included in the discussion. So now that that's done with, as a warm-up, let's look at our first and smallest grievance for today, word choice. If you're a writer or reader or fellow appreciator of saying words, you know that your mood informs what you say and the other way around. This is the most basic step of lit analysis you'll ever be confronted with. When a character describes a random stretch of the woods and calls it patchy with stabbing, grasping vines that cringe in the flaky shadow, that will communicate a different mood than lush brambles curling over the dappled ground like the locks of a maiden. You see that, right? Word choice tells us a lot about a character. Their view of the world, their mood, the knowledge they have about what they're observing, and the vocabulary they have to describe it with, basic but important part of characterization. The supreme discipline of this, in my opinion, is a character describing someone else as either ugly or not at all, denoting them as unnoteworthy at the beginning of a story, and as it progresses, the descriptions change and become more and more flowery and detailed as the point of view character gets closer to the person. Beautiful, no corny dialogue needed. On the other hand, hand, this can become an issue if done wrong. In a lot of trashy enemies to lovers romance, the voice of our protagonist describes their enemy's body in really positive terms for some reason. If you hate him so much, why are you describing his abs as rippling, glistening, carved by an artist perfection, and still claim that you're not feeling a shred of attraction? If you insist you find him repulsive, but you keep describing him like a tall glass of Diet Coke after an open-air desert rave, the characterization here is, you're delusional, completely out of touch with your emotions. Farrah, we can't keep doing this. You have a problem. Farrah, you need help. Even if it's just physical, genuine dislike of someone will influence that too. Martin usually maneuvers this very well. One handy example is the description of Joffrey's lips from Sansa's perspective. All throughout A Game of Thrones, she finds him beautiful and gallant, as only an inbred 12-year-old can be. But in Storm of Swords, by which point she dislikes him for some mysterious reason, she describes his physical appearance in mostly negative terms, famously calling his lips fat and wormy. Sansa's attitude towards Joffrey has shifted, and so has her inner voice. Another unique example is Bran's POV, because he's the youngest character we get to follow.
The most difficult viewpoint character to write is Bran, and he has always been the hardest. He is the youngest viewpoint character, which is difficult in and of itself, because when you're writing a character that young, you can't simply write what's going on. You have to filter everything through, okay, he's 8 years old, what does he understand? He's seeing this scene, does he actually understand what's happening in this scene?
Starting out at 7 years of age, Bran doesn't recognize the scrawny sentenced man at the beginning of Thrones as a brother of the Night's Watch because he's only got stories of heroism to go off of. He doesn't understand what Cersei and Jaime are doing when he sees them through the window. He X-ray visions a scale mail jerkin to comment on a girl's tit. The description of this scene is a little weird. This doesn't seem like a detail that's immediately apparent to somebody just casually observing, especially if the character in question isn't clothed in a way that would warrant observation by a child. This is also not the only time Bran does this. To be fair, Asha is naked when he talks to her, but describing her chest as 2 empty purses? This is a choice? I mean, to be fair, he's a kid, and his view of the world is very literal. You know, he might just be referencing the things he sees very simplistically. A woman's body is probably his best indication for her age, and even though these descriptions clash a little logistically, it's not a big deal, right? It's the same with Cersei giving Tyrion a look at the top of her breasts, because, I mean, that's his perspective as a short person, and in this scene, Catelyn has a reason to judge Rosalind's looks, because Rob's party expected her to be super ugly. Or here, where Tyrion is contemplating his lover's betrayal moments before looking her in the eyes and killing her, thinking about her boobs, because that's a really important, or Aaron Greyjoy thinking about the boobs of another man's wife, who he doesn't give a shit about, because Brienne of Tarth contemplating a random unnamed side character's boobs, because or Victorian Greyjoy giving a lot of thought to the body of a ship figurine and her boobs. Some guy named Hotho describing his own daughter's small breasts. How is this a selling point anyway? Why bring that up? Daenerys describing Jiki's boobs 4 books into the series. Okay, some of these make more sense than others. I mean, we all know that Cersei's boobs are the standard measurement of height in Westeros, but you do see how characters seem strangely fixated on certain parts of the female body. And I'm not referring to where this is used for characterization, as we've discussed before. You know, this is a legitimate way of establishing attraction. Or maybe the character is comparing their own body to that of another woman, or noting irregularities. But that's not what any of these are about. I didn't include instances like Aerys Oakheart, who is really into Princess Arianne, and so describes her in, man, not even detail, he just keeps going. And there's a lot to pull from. A lot of characters pay attention to women's bodies for some reason that fits the narrative, but so many others just don't? Why does Catelyn Stark remember her sister Lysa as high-breasted? Completely needless attention to Brienne's body by a feverish Jaime scraping on death's door. I urge you to remember that the word chest exists. Theon/Reek giving us a 7-word description of one body part of the innocent woman he ended, together with her children, to save his pride? This man's spirit has been broken. I don't care about the relationship he had with that woman, he's contemplating the worst crime he's ever committed. And this is where his thoughts go? I hope you understand what I mean by craft critique now, because this doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Why include these descriptions when they don't fit the character or the situation? What happened to filtering through the POV? The worst cases of this are when Martin's female characters describe their own boobs in their narrative voice. Because what reason would they have to note this about themselves? This specifically is an issue I maybe wouldn't necessarily attribute to misogyny, at least not directly. It's an old joke that male authors overdescribe their female characters' bodies for no reason. There's a subreddit about it, but I think that a different failure accounts for a lot of these cases. That failure being overestimating how much a person would notice a body part that you don't personally have on a daily basis. Imagine this. An author writes elves into their setting, so they describe them as having pointy ears. But then they describe them as having pointy ears again, in situations that do not call for it. The elf protagonists contemplate the pointiness of other elves' ears, even though that's of zero consequence to them, the story, or the reader, and pointiness is also implied by virtue of a person being an elf. And then the elves describe their own ears, not like when we first meet them and they give us a cursory overview of what they look like, or in situations where they'd have cause to notice them, just every now and again. Why? And you better believe that the human characters in the setting never think about their own ears. The elves just like to comment on a physical feature they shouldn't realistically be noticing at all. Because that's what happens when you've had a certain body for a while. If it's not brought to your attention, you're not gonna think about it. And if an author doesn't take that into consideration, characterization suffers. If you let every character, no matter their age, gender, or sexuality, comment on women's bodies, the potentially important signifiers of real emotion are lost. What Brienne describes in the example I gave earlier is the body of an older, rude, thick-set peasant innkeeper. If Brienne was describing the body of, say, Marjorie Tyrell, we could reasonably assume she was focusing on the biological, feminine traits she feels she's lacking. Boom! State of mind communicated. But now that wouldn't fucking matter, would it? Because apparently that's just what the Maid of Tarth chooses to pay attention to in general. The normal and reasonable thing to do in response to Martin's descriptions of women looking at other women, of course, is to go gay, which has undoubtedly spawned some of the better sub-communities in this fandom, but even women who are attracted to women don't think about their bodies that way. You're just gonna have to take my word for that one. But also, we know that this is specifically not the case with Cersei because she sleeps with a woman in Feast and doesn't feel shit. Surprise, show watchers. Never forget what they took from us. Seriously though, this is a singular occurrence that's made very clear to be a power trip born from anger. So what's that inner monologue about, girl? Word choice, in some other cases, messes with the logic of Martin's narrative in a major way, but we'll get to that. Just now, I want to wrap this segment up as productively as I can. Whenever Martin is asked why he puts nighttime content of any kind in his books, he usually claims that it's honest. Having nighttime be someone's motivation is honest. Not including nighttime violence in a society that's based on the distant past wouldn't be honest. But I hope we've explored how none of these descriptions really support that argument. It seems to me that in order to make his characters' voices as strong, unique, and honest as possible, Martin could choose to use his physical descriptions of female characters more selectively. I don't think that's an unreasonable or unkind thing to note. I don't think it would hurt the story. Because George, I'm not here to tell you that you're not allowed to call a woman's privates a Mirish swamp. Just to remind you that you can choose not to. Or, alternatively include some more descriptions of Mirish woodland. Still wouldn't make a lot of sense most of the time, but if you're trying to beat incel allegations, it might level the playing field. At least to those readers who agree on there being a problem in the first place. I think the time has come to look at one of the biggest arguments in Martin's favor. he can't possibly be accused of misogyny. He has powerful women in his books. I mean, look at them all. Such a wide, diverse cast of female characters is notable not only by fantasy saga standards, but arguably those of traditional publishing. If anything, George R.R. Martin pioneers feminism.
But there have been changes in the feminist movement, and I've had some women in the subsequent years tell me I can't be a feminist because I shouldn't use that term for myself because I'm a male. And, well, okay, I'm not going to dictate anyone else's terminology to them. I certainly don't want to offend anyone by calling myself a feminist.
See, he's too politically correct to even say it. Welcome back, Simone de Beauvoir. It appears that even if I can prove that Martin makes a huge distinction between his descriptions of men and women, he basically deserves a trophy for including both in the first place. And this interviewer right here seems to agree.
So it is historically accurate, but you've also taken advantage of the possibilities of fantasy by creating female characters who couldn't have existed, and who, warriors, manipulative priestesses, the queen with dragons. But to be historically accurate would be to limit your character development. It's more fun to move into fantasy with women.
Maybe we should stop letting people who can't read do these. Okay, I'm being a mean pedant again. I am sorry, undoubtedly very nice and professional lady who is probably just repeating what she's been taught in school. It's not your fault, but you must understand that the women Martin is writing are not disproportionately powerful or competent by any measure. When they do have power, a real-life parallel exists. Martin will tell you so himself.
I don't think I have moved into fantasy with women aside from Danny's Dragons. You can find an analog for every one of the women in my books.
Does Asiaf feature patriarchal societies? Yes. Is it difficult for women to amass power in patriarchal societies? Also yes. But is it impossible? Is it unheard of? Is it even notably unusual? Not really. Just look at Margaret of Anjou, Empress Matilda, Isabella of Powerful female leaders Martin has explicitly drawn inspiration from, and I did have to Google them, because I don't give a shit about the Middle Ages on a regular basis, alright? But that's my point. All of these are very easily Googleable. The people who complain about these power dynamics being ahistorical and overly PC are telling on themselves for not knowing history. Because no, women being competent is not unrealistic. You're just holding on to a version of the past that's either deliberately hateful or shaped by misinformation. Have a look at my favorite example. In the epic poem The Fairy Queen, published in the 1500s, the lady knight Britomart, who I suspect might have been an inspiration for Brienne, wears armor, goes on a quest, and defeats other knights in jousts and combat. And while she is a fictional character, she does prove that woman with sword is not as novel a concept as we think. This whole thing is also why I dislike the "oh, it's all just fantasy" argument. They can have women leading armies. They have dragons. Sure, or maybe they can have women leading armies because women, on occasion, led armies. Maybe they can have women leading armies and we don't have to pretend that that's on the same level of bizarre as fire-breathing lizards. And I will say this, Martin gets it. Say what you will about his books, which I'm gonna do, but his cast of women and girls is reasonably big, diverse, and honest. And if other traditional fantasy writers had a fraction of his willingness to portray history using the female perspective, the world would be a better place. However, we must also keep in mind that the reason for this is that Martin shines by comparison. Because remember, women have always featured in history. Other writers leaving them out is a subtraction of reality, not a reasonable standard. When Martin writes his female characters, he's not doing women some sort of crazy favor. This is not deliberate inclusion or activism. It's being mathematically balanced. I don't want to call it the bare minimum. I do think he deserves credit for doing it, but it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for how he depicts women. For the time the books came out in, this was not so radical a step as to excuse this word choice, nor any of the other complaints I mean to raise. I realize that to many of you, this first segment seems nitpicky. I recognize that there's people among my audience who aren't put off by these sorts of descriptions. Hell, I have to consider that some of you didn't even notice them. Maybe this is how you see the world. Who's to say? But even so, I think we should all be able to acknowledge that this writing style probably doesn't speak to women as an intended audience. Describing and segmenting bodies like this comes dangerously close to what we call objectification, treating women as things to be judged by desire or lack thereof first, and a human being second. Most of my audience is male. Objectification, by all accounts, shouldn't be something many of you have a whole lot of experience with. So imagine with me, if you will, handing the average straight guy a BL manhwa. Because no, there might not be anything in there that will necessarily keep you from enjoying the story, but there's a good chance your reading experience will be littered with, I guess it can do that. Mine never has. Even if it's not explicitly nighttime-y, there's an expectation here about what the intended reader would be focusing on. When the book features people who look like you, but they're disproportionately being looked at, put into situations that allow for them to be looked at, and you feel that disconnect between what the author is providing and what your perception of reality looks like, chances are the author just didn't consider your perspective. In other words, the book was not written for you. I think that there is a case to be made for A Song of Ice and Fire not being written for women, not in the sense that we can't enjoy it, but that there's an extra layer of separation between us and the best parts of the story. Now, if Martin were to be taken to the Twitter chopping block for anything, I don't think it should be the crime of having a target audience. I don't believe every single story has to be written with everybody's feelings in mind, as long as it's not hateful towards the groups it happens to leave out. But I'd be really grateful if the public debate arena acknowledged that women are not being catered to by this book series. The starting point for readers is not equal, and it's not anyone's delicate sensibilities that are responsible for that. You can say you aren't bothered by Martin's word choice, but can you genuinely say that they objectively make sense for the character? If so, I'm very curious as to what you think of part 2. Out of Pocket. I feel like I can remember hearing somewhere that George R.R. Martin believes he cannot put trigger warnings in his books. Don't quote me on that though. When I tried to find the interview again, it just gave me pages and pages of trigger warnings for his books. Anyway, I believe he said that it would spoil the story. I don't quite know how I feel about that, but I do know that it's not a craft critique and thereby need not concern us today. But I'm no stranger to books really messing with your head. You know, everybody has different personal boundaries, and I think that people who want to look out for themselves in their media consumption should have the chance to do so. It's just really shocking watching characters just casually sitting around enjoying what you think is a peaceful moment, and suddenly one of them goes, "And such a pretty young kitchen wench will incite lust as well as curiosity. She will be touched, pinched, patted and fondled. Potboys will crawl under her blanket of a night. Some lonely cook may seek to wed her. Bakers will knead her breasts with floured hands." Excuse me? I am going to give you context for this scene, and I wish that would explain what it means or why it's in the book, but it doesn't. This is from a Tyrion chapter in Clash. He and Varys are discussing where to hide his mistress Shay, and when Tyrion suggests she might work in the palace kitchens, Varys drops this gold nugget of dialogue. Okay, so Varys in the books is a bit weirder, where show Varys is very, "Oh, what an interesting development." Book Varys is murder. I don't know how else to explain it, but even book Varys doesn't usually use this kind of vocabulary. What is this weirdly eloquent locker room talk? Why say this? To the guy whose girlfriend you're referring to, this is so random, yet so handy, because it's just not graphic enough for me to read out and give you a sense of what this segment is about. Welcome to disconnected, out-of-pocket shit Martin has written. Starting strong, we look to Theon Greyjoy. On his journey to Lordsport, the captain of the ship he's taking has his daughter with him. Maybe that's the norm, I'm no seaman. We don't know her name because why would we? We only know that Theon has spent nighttime with her repeatedly, that she was a maiden, and that her father disapproved but let this happen in exchange for gold, but also that she's certain he'll beat her for this. Cutting out all of their dialogue, the nighttime scene between her and Theon is 229 words long, with about 52 words parts, falling into the category of focus we looked at in the first segment. We're also told Theon leaves her with child and stops associating with her immediately because he's bored of her. Have I mentioned she doesn't have a name? As media analysts on the internet are fond of asking, why? What does this add to the story? Introducing a nameless, storyless, relevance-less character for basically no reason doesn't seem like a professional, highbrow author thing to do. And this is far from the only example. In Dance, Tyrion travels around with someone we assume is Aegon, the surviving son of Rhaegar and Elia, a surprise again, show watchers, and with them is a septa named Lenore, to whom it seems weirdly important to bathe in the river completely naked and in view of her companions every day. We get multiple scenes of Tyrion watching and describing and imagining her. We're told that Lenore isn't as innocent as she seems and enjoys teasing him. A book earlier, we have Jaime walking in on Jonas Bracken, engaged in pretty detailed nighttime with a woman named Hildy. Hildy is a woman of dubious origin who goes from being really shy and coy to coming on to Jaime saucily for what seems like no reason. It's definitely not social climbing because she doesn't change her tune once she realizes who Jaime is, but by the end of that scene she flirts with and touches him up as she walks past. It's just really random. Victorian Greyjoy, who is a brother of Euron, has a woman with him on his travels who is basically his slave. She doesn't get a name either, even though we spend a lot more time with her. He only refers to her as his dusky woman. She's only of consequence to the story because Victorian decides he doesn't need to keep any of the nighttime worker girls he's captured to himself. We of course get descriptions of all of them before they die. Back in Dance, Tyrion harasses a woman he ends up spending nighttime with. No name for her either. We also get Magister Illyrio talking about how he was so wildly into Daenerys when she was staying with him at 13 years old that he had to summon a nighttime worker to spend time with until the madness passed. Good to know. Asha Greyjoy, who the show renamed Yara, tells us about her tumultuous youth with one Christopher Botley. Lo, a name! For a man. Still no relevancy, though. Also, not how a period works. Princess Arianne making herself memorable beyond Aerys Oakheart's ogling by telling him that if he's cheating on her, she'll naked knife fight the other woman? Except for if she's a sand snake, of course. Arianne doesn't mind sharing with her cousins. All of this is what I would define as out of pocket. It's not that these scenes are so bizarre that I'd forbid an author from including them in their writing. I hope I've made clear that that's not what I'm trying to do in general, but I fail to see how any of these match up with Martin's explanations as to why Asyaf has so much nighttime content. Of course, none of the people who asked him that pulled up a list like this, at least not to my knowledge, but if they did, it seems he'd have to explain quite a few scenes that seem to serve little to no narrative purpose. There's this rule in writing that everything you include in a story has to justify its own existence. As Mary Cole, professional editor and publishing industry veteran, puts it, every scene and every chapter must not only develop character and story and world, they must also move the plot forward. And this might seem very harsh to non-writers. I'm sure some of you feel you've read tons of scenes that do nothing of the sort, but I invite you to get up right now and go to your bookshelf, pick up the first acclaimed novel you see and open it to any page. If you read carefully, you will notice that what you're seeing does something. Whether it's a flashback, a scene of characters talking, there's substance here. A situation is being recontextualized, the speakers characterized by their words, gestures, and reactions. Now, some people will tell you that you can't apply this logic to Asyaf because it's an extensive fantasy saga. I can't claim Martin's nighttime scenes are pointless because he writes pointless scenes all the time. The series' most valiant defenders, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of people have this view of the books as these heavy, slow-paced tomes, which, first of all, you wouldn't last an hour in the asylum where they raised me, but also parts of a story being slow-paced and pointless are two very different things, and I'd argue that Asyaf is neither. Most of Robb's driest warring and politicking happens completely off-page. Dany's perilous way through the Red Waste takes less than a chapter. Most eventual Cersei POVs are just last time on the small council. Like, compared to some of the writers Martin has has stated inspired him, Asayaf's pacing is fine. It's fine, guys. Even Bran, who I know everyone loves to shit on, is basically our strongest funnel for lore. Stuff like travel, his dreams, or stories he remembers are half the book's exposition. Hearing about the tourney at Harrenhal might not be the interesting thing in that book, but it still makes you feel like the world is unfurling a little bit before your eyes, stretching back into the past. At worst, it's giving us some insight into the early political landscape and house dynamics. At best, it's setting up context for a reveal about Jon's parentage, which is still unclear in the books, by the way. Man's just dead as of right now. Can you honestly claim that the nighttime scenes we've looked at have the same effect? Serve as much purpose as a conversation? Serve any purpose at all? Well, any purpose we like to acknowledge. Maybe some of them do, at least more than others. Maybe the nameless captain's daughter is meant to characterize Theon as a callous, lecherous man, even though the next thing we see him do is touch up his sister because he believes her to be a strange, married, pregnant woman. Tyrion's shit behavior might give us insight into his dark state of mind, even though he does this twice in Dance. Lenore is traveling with Aegon Targaryen. Maybe she'll turn out to secretly be a character eventually. But some scenes are not even afforded the benefit of the doubt. They are so out of pocket, it's pointless trying to shove them into one. When Daenerys is in the House of the Undying in Clash, one of her visions is of a beautiful woman spending ungentle nighttime with multiple little men, as a reference to the war going on in Westeros. Maybe. No other way to imply that. In the prophetic drug trip, Martin could have chosen to design however he wanted. Another treasure trove of disconnected nonsense are the pro and epilogues. You know, the little chapter-long stories you can read at the very beginning and end of the book. In Asayaf, they're famously narrated by side characters who die instantly after a few pages in the spotlight. 3 of these narrators are Chet, Merritt Frey, and Voromir Sixskins. Chet is the Night's Watch resident incel who landed himself on the wall by murdering a girl after she refused to sleep with him. We're treated to more colorful language when he describes how she totally wanted any guy except him and what a bitch she was being before he gets killed by White and I'm put out of my misery. Structurally, this seems like a great way of introducing us to more of the Night's Watch dynamics and make us fear the Whites, but I question the wisdom of expanding on a random side character's backstory like this. He's gonna die in 5 minutes. Why do we need his Reddit posts? Merritt Frey is not much different. Yada yada, my family sucks, and also my daughter is a slut. The epilogue of Storm of Swords serves one purpose, introducing us to Lady Stoneheart. Lady Stoneheart is Catelyn Stark, brought back to life by the Red Priest that previously kept resurrecting Beric Dondarrion like my parents did with my goldfish. This shocking reveal that the show chose to leave out completely takes a bit of a back seat to Merritt complaining about how much trouble his daughter's promiscuity is causing. Oh, I'm on my way to meet some bandits. Also, my child is a hoe. Okay. But worse than both of them is Voromir Sixskins. As a wildling warg, he's relatively interesting. Still didn't need to tell us about how he did nighttime violence to a ton of women by threatening them with his animals, though. Why do we need to know this? These pro/epilogues illustrate perfectly what the issue with these contents is, because they do it on a smaller scale. You can have interesting world building conveyed by interesting characters, but if they're in a really stressful situation that would probably demand any other kind of focus, why do we keep swerving to nighttime? This is uniquely useless information. Another strong contender from actual book POVs comes to us from yet another Reek/Theon chapter. Roose Bolton borrows Reek from Ramsay. I'll say that 10 times. Because he's still the lawful heir of the Iron Islands, and that makes him briefly relevant to the stance the Boltons are taking against Stannis coming down from the wall. At some point along the journey, Roose decides to explain how Ramsay was conceived. In the books, it's specified that he's a bastard born of nighttime violence, and his father does go into detail about this, which makes perfect sense, because who likes sharing random personal anecdotes with their hostages more than Roose fucking Bolton? Something tells me he wouldn't have been so chatty if this were about literally anything else. And that brings us to the ugly accusation, doesn't it? Martin writes nighttime content randomly when it doesn't make much sense to do so, which unfortunately translates into Martin writes nighttime content at the cost of his book's quality. Because even if it turns out that he was going somewhere with most of these scenes, they'd still all be existing in the same book series. Repeated testament to the fact that he chose to do this instead of opting for any other more effective narrative tool that would have checked the scene boxes more easily. This is especially noticeable because, I should stress again, the rest of Asyaf isn't like this. These books are well written, so it was pretty difficult for me not to be a bit startled every time the story takes a break for someone to drop their pants. And you know these aren't productive scenes of characters developing their dynamic negatively or positively. If they were, I wouldn't be bringing it up in a speculation about misogyny, because remember, books for women by women are chock full of nighttime. This is women-approved territory. But many of Martin's nighttime scenes are not just dubiously consensual, they are very violent. According to one count later reported by The Telegraph, there are a staggering number of 214 instances of extreme nighttime violence in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, with the minuscule exception of 1 or 2 cases, the victims of which are women. Some of these are off-page mentions or failed attempts, but it still means that anyone reading this book series is going to have to deal with that mental image 214 times. There are a lot of different editions of Asyaf, but if we use the page count provided by Wikipedia, that comes out to just about 1 every 21 pages, and that's not even counting the times something consensual happens that could be read as needless sexualization. I hope this also gives us some perspective for why the complaint that the nighttime in the books is gratuitous doesn't usually communicate the problem, because gratuitous is a completely subjective word. And I don't know about you, but if someone told me that there's gratuitous violence in a piece of media that's otherwise extremely well received, I wouldn't assume that it's significantly worse than average. I'd assume the person I'm talking to is unusually sensitive. I am not above admitting that, but it is important to me that you understand just how needless the scenes I showed you are. I'm writing a war story, essentially. The Wars of the Roses, the 100 Years' War. They have war right in the title of each of my inspirations here. And when I read history books, a part of all these wars. There's never been a war where it wasn't, and that includes wars that are going on today. It just seems to me that there's something fundamentally dishonest if you write a war story and you leave that out. George, not one of these was a direct effect of war. Okay, well, maybe Hildy was, but other than that, saying that you're portraying war when what you show is oftentimes just factionless individuals being horrible, that is a bit misleading. It also kind of drains the criticism out of what is happening. Arya's chapters at Harrenhal, the stuff the Brotherhood Without Banners comes across, and a lot of the Bloody Mummers' actions are horrible and made out to be horrible by every element of Martin's writing. Yes, so are the things that especially evil men do to be characterized as do not root for, people like Joffrey and Ramsay, and Euron, Viserys, Gregor Clegane, Roose Bolton, Craster, Rorge, Bider, arguably Tyrion and Dance. If you want to view all of these instances as bad men being enabled by bad war, okay, but what about Theon abusing Kira in Clash? What about the more vividly detailed nighttime the slave master Astapor is describing in front of Dany, or Drogo lifting her up to have nighttime with her in view of other people when he feels like it? What makes these scenes part of war, and how would leaving them out be fundamentally dishonest? Another issue is that when Martin includes nighttime violence, he doesn't tend to show its effects in a way you'd expect of someone so keen on honesty. We can debate about whether a choiceless 13-year-old pressured to marry a strange 30-year-old counts as consensual. I know I've seen people waste their afternoons doing that, but even if you refuse to call this what it is, if you insist, like Martin, that this is not technically a violation, I think we can safely say that it's not a huge positive for a young person's development. One of the worst aspects of child marriage is said to be the isolation, the premature integration initiation into the adult world that cuts off contact to free peers and free development and replaces it with the duty of childbearing. This most definitely happens to Dany. Even though she assimilates well to the Dothraki culture and gets along fine with her handmaidens, she's still a Khaleesi now, far away from anything she knows, people who speak her language, people she can trust. And her relationship with Drogo isn't like good either. He tolerates her when she does what he likes. Literally, any and all charm that Khal Drogo has in the show comes from rewrites of them actually talking to each other and from known friend and ally to women, Jason Momoa. And yet, there Daenerys is, years later, having matured from teenager to slightly older teenager, insisting that Drogo was her one true love. The guy who was fine with marrying a choiceless 13-year-old who was clearly terrified of him. Just like in real life, there are many ways of reacting to extreme events that disturb childhood development, but being just fine is rarely one of them, and it's even more rarely all of them. In the books, Sansa is constantly threatened with nighttime violence by Joffrey. He assaults her at her wedding to Tyrion, he harasses and humiliates her any chance he gets, yet when Sansa considers her prospective marriage to an 8-year-old Robin Arryn after he somewhat innocently kicks over her snow castle, she thinks to herself, at least Joffrey was sound of body. I mean, yes, I feel like he also did something you didn't like, though. What was it again? From what I remember, the constant threat of Vargo Hoat's men doesn't really scar Brienne in a major way. Similarly, the violence that Dothraki inflict upon other women doesn't seem to faze Dany too much in the long run. She protects women, yeah, but her attitude towards her blood riders isn't really impacted, and neither is the way she engages in nighttime herself. This is one of the ways ACF differs fundamentally from the other books displaying nighttime violence I mentioned. All of these show honest consequences for their honesty, whereas Martin is usually content mentioning in interviews that what he's writing is really tragic, I promise. A label is one thing, but it's almost as if all but the most severe cases of abuse, like that of Jane Poole at the hands of Ramsay, don't really need to be processed that much. But they really should be. Like, developed countries didn't change child marriage laws and move the age of consent up because they randomly decided they liked higher numbers better. The bad effects of these practices have always existed, and even a culture that normalized them wouldn't have gotten rid of them. This is also where we return to word choice. If you admit repeatedly that what you're showing is bad, but your descriptive vocabulary doesn't give the impression that a character is too upset about it, you failed at conveying bad. In Daenerys' third POV chapter, Martin wrote that she was in so much pain and hated everything that was happening to her so much that she considered not living, rather than enduring it any longer. And what changes this is largely a dream. Granted, it may have been a magical dream. The point is, these experiences don't seem to shape Dany's view of the world too much. It's really difficult to explain because it's mechanically so granular, but if you look at these books, nighttime violence of all kinds is usually described using a mixture of pretty jarring vocabulary and purposeful omission of detail. These authors relay these events in a way that does justice to how grotesque they are. I think it's almost safe to say that most of them would not go for horse metaphors. You can't make the argument that nighttime violence is just like any other kind of violence in ACF, and oh look, everybody's being treated badly, it's just realism, when scenes of other kinds of violence are described with vastly different degrees of severity and aftermath. This is one of the worst things that can happen to any person ever. Not to make a direct comparison here, I don't think that's possible, but think about how much time we spent on Jaime losing his hand. The pain, the shock, the humiliation of losing the thing you're valued most for in your society. My argument is not that ACF should be filled with more of women's horrific suffering, just that if Martin is unwilling to portray the suffering that would come out of the scenes he chooses to include, maybe he shouldn't include them, which is, I hope we've established, an option here. So when Martin says he's describing the truth of war, in order for that explanation to hold up, he'd have to stop neglecting the psychological consequences of that truth. The out-of-pocket category encompasses scenes of nighttime or nighttime violence that could be left out without affecting the plot and mostly aren't addressed again through on-page character development. We've looped back around to Martin writes nighttime content at the cost of his book's quality, but the even less generous interpretation here would be Martin writes titillating nighttime content that often borders on or is violence and calls his critics pervs for pointing it out, but he doesn't want to include the ugliest details of nighttime violence like lifelong trauma or physical injuries. Especially the first part of that accusation would, for instance, be supported by the violence against Daenerys and Cersei, which Martin still claims are both consensual in the books. This has caused quite enough drama in the past, and I'm not interested in adding to it, so we'll instead look at another scene that potentially serves as evidence. I've never seen it brought up in interviews, probably because it wasn't adapted in the show and fewer people got to angrily tweet about it. So, another content warning at this point, just to be sure. This one's a bit complicated. In Dance, Asha Greyjoy and her crew are occupying Deepwood Motte, the seat of House Glover. And at some point, one of her crewmates just assaults Asha in the most violent way. She reaches for her weapon, she threatens his life and tries to defend herself, but fails. Things progress. And when it's all over, apparently this wasn't weird. Asha doesn't make good on her promise to kill him in his sleep. She seems pretty unfazed, really. So I guess the implication here is that this was some kind of CNC shit, just fully set up as extreme nighttime violence, but then not? It's just so bizarre, and it remains bizarre even if this wasn't non-consensual, because that's undeniably how this extremely needless scene is written. Why did Martin write this? Because Martin enjoyed writing it? And what does that mean? I promised myself I wasn't going to make assumptions about his moral character based on his books. I don't know if I believe in separating the art from the artist in the way that phrase is often used today, but I do understand that a writer is not his work, at least not in the most literal sense. There are those out there who would judge authors themselves by the actions of their characters, even if the scenes make sense and have severe consequences. I hope I've made it apparent that that is not a view I stand for. To demand censorship of these things on principle is not only unrealistic in a practical sense, but it would also deny survivors the space to discuss their experiences. The push to limit art can be more powerfully dangerous than the art itself. Censorship of nighttime violence should be used very selectively. I will say, trigger warnings probably wouldn't hurt, but at the end of the day, if Martin wants to write scenes that aren't affected by real-life logic or basic morality, he is free to do so. Except, we have a word for doing that, and the word is erotica. I'm not proposing Martin rebrand Asiaf as an erotic fiction series, there's just too much standing in the way of that, but I don't think it's unreasonable to point out that his writing shares a lot of characteristics with the genre. Mainly, nighttimey things happen with extreme frequency, a bit like the book has a timer that says, wow, it's almost been 20 pages, time for something fucky to happen again. They seem to happen in a morally isolated space in which they don't affect the character's feelings towards their partner, themselves, or the world. If they are not exceptionally violent, they are very rarely the result of a relationship we see developed on page. And finally, nighttime usually follows extremely similar patterns and routines, with hundreds of different characters seemingly sharing tastes in body parts and activities. If you're a reader, I don't need to tell you which ones. Almost as if the author isn't actually taking the opportunity for characterization, but exploring scenarios he himself finds interesting over and and over. Please don't misunderstand what I'm trying to do here. Even if these admitted speculations somehow could be proven 100% right, I still wouldn't want to judge Martin by them directly. Lots of readers like morally questionable stuff in fiction. To imply that there was a strong link between consuming or even creating these materials and being violent or inappropriate in real life sort of diminishes how serious of a step these offenses are. No, browsing the dubcon tag on AO3 doesn't make you rotten to the core. Modern philosopher and goddess ContraPoints has made a video exploring this not too long ago. I recommend you watch it. Not because it's that necessary for understanding this point, just because it's really good. Anyway, writing weird shit does not a sexual deviant make. In fact, if you do feel like you connect with what we'd call problematic themes, I'd encourage you to explore them through writing rather than anything else. Because even more so than a certain video industry known for exploiting its workers or real-life people you might creep out, reading something can't hurt anyone other than yourself. Literature is an interaction between author and consumer. It does not need to involve literally anyone else. It allows you to safely process your feelings in perfect isolation, and this is especially useful if what you're feeling is not socially acceptable. However, and this is important, for this to work, you should be aware that that's what you're doing. Human beings draw from stories. Whether it's a rom-com, military propaganda, or a children's cartoon, we learn from the narratives we consume. We're shaped by them. To come back to part 1 again, it's just fantasy is not and has never been a reasonable thing to say in response to anything at all. Maybe because fantasy fundamentally reflects the attitudes and values we have as a society at any given time, since we're free to structure political systems and social norms how we see fit in a made-up universe. You can also see how the standards of fantasy writing have drastically changed over time. It's art imitating life, life imitating art in an endless circle. So where does the nasty fit into this? Well, it doesn't. Hear me out. As we've explored, erotic contents aren't meant to mirror reality. If you want a story in which a character kidnaps and has their way with another character, who in turn is super into this and carries no lifelong psychosexual issues, and you imply that this is realistic, that's wrong. Because people are going to read that story and make conclusions about how humans work. If you have wildly unrealistic nighttime in your book, then you have a moral obligation to signal to your reader that they're not meant to mix this up with reality. Because if you don't, your readers may not be as vigilant to the difference as they should be and accidentally bring the social conduct they observed into polite society with them. The label of erotica primes the brain to store information as separate from other stories. You don't suspend your disbelief like you normally would because you expect the characters to behave irrationally to allow for the thing to be happening. Because that's the point. One area this failure of categorization is currently causing massive problems in is on book talk. Because girls want to read weird shit, and publishers want to make money off of girls wanting to read weird shit. But erotic books are not only really difficult to advertise, women are also taught that we aren't supposed to have these sorts of desires in the first place, meaning that that label is out of the question. So what the publishers do is sell weird shit, but call it dark romance, or romantasy, or spice. In effect, selling erotica without the commercial burden that is calling it erotica. But because the distinction between story and action isn't there, everything in that community space goes completely to shit, because now 1/2 of people are advertising books they love because they read them between 7 and 10 p.m. You know, the business hours, and confused that with quality writing, pissing off anyone who takes their reading recommendations, and the other is aimlessly going on about how we shouldn't romanticize abuse and declaring anyone who likes morally questionable plotlines a problematic pro-shipper. It's so incredibly painful to watch. I can't begin to describe how much this has ruined my book talk experience. Every time I see someone make fun of slideshows like these, I have the impulse to scream at my phone. Yes, they are cringe and degenerate. Congratulations for noticing, but would you make that same video about images like this? No, because you know what purpose it has, and it's not to be intellectual or morally guiding. All of this can be avoided, people. God, this was a video about ASAF, wasn't it? So you see, you can write basically anything, but if you build your reputation on being historically accurate and honest in whatever you create, you better be damn careful that you don't have your readers internalizing wrong assumptions about human behavior, such as women deciding to randomly find pleasure in what is being done to them, or not understanding how nipples work. In some bizarre way, looking at it like this might even be kinder towards Martin, because as severe as the consequences of this failure to separate can be, it's still just that, a failure. Not a deliberate assumption that this is how women are. Do you remember how I mentioned that Martin claims the Dany and Cersei scenes were consensual? Well, his own writing isn't really on his side here. Objectively, Dany is just too young to consent to the arranged marriage she doesn't want to go through with, and Cersei quite clearly tells Jaime no at first. But what if that's not what Martin means? If you told him, out of context, that a brother doing this to his sister was not okay, I genuinely assume he would agree with you. I think his reasoning may have a lot more to do with seeing his character's inner workings. In his mind, Drogo and Jaime somehow knew that what they were doing was going to be received favorably by these women, despite evidence to the contrary. You know, like in an erotica. Okay, this segment was longer than it needed to be, but I feel that it was necessary to clarify what the issue here is. It's not that what Martin wrote is so exceptionally diabolical, he deserves jail time for being a twisted boy. It's just that due to the authentic nature of his writing, hitches in realism like this are quite noticeable to the attentive reader. And if he doesn't fix his faltering consistency, eventually that might just come across as self-indulgence, because only showing the deed and not its most uncomfortable consequences doesn't sound too honest to me. And if you don't want to deal with the aftermath, just don't put it on page. Which is, as we'll see, another massive problem. Because Martin's dedication to honesty also somehow dictates he describe, or at least mention, nighttime violence to be happening with at least some attached detail. I will say that my philosophy as a writer since the very start of my career has been one of show, don't tell. Whatever might be happening in my books, I try to put the reader in the middle of it, rather than summarizing the action. That requires vivid sensory detail. I don't want distance, I want to put you there. When the scene in question is a sex scene, some readers find that intensely uncomfortable, and that's 10 times as true for scenes of sexual violence. But that is as it should be. Certain scenes are meant to be uncomfortable, disturbing, hard to read. In case you haven't heard of it, show don't tell is exactly what it says on the tin, and is usually the most effective way of telling a story in writing. I mean, how else is Martin gonna get his feminist commentary on violence against women across? So you see, Martin is just a visual storyteller. He confronts you with the reality of his writing, and your comfort isn't something he can consider when he's prioritizing honesty. At least his fans think so. And I continue to have bad news for them. For you see, we have an almost direct comparison here to another interesting concept, one that Martin has incorporated as a series-spanning, shameful, intrinsically human element that many people are really squeamish about in fantasy, and done it without ever showing it on page. Happy June, motherfucker. Glue. There is explicit homosexuality in ASAF. If you're a reader, you know that Cersei and Daenerys both spend quite detailed nighttime with women on page, with Irri and Lady Merryweather respectively. We also know of Princess Arianne and Ilaria Sand's outspoken openness to involve other women in their nighttime with men. It's really just male homosexuality that's missing from the picture, although that's not true. I've had the funniest debates about this with fellow readers. They're like, oh, the show changed this. Not that I have a problem with it, I just think Martin might not have intended it. Well, he did.
Is there a purpose that I had for making the characters gay? Well, I've noticed that there are gay people in the world.
And I could have told you so if I'd read the book sooner. I say confidently after having watched the show. But seriously, you've got that maester in the prologue going, Renly was such a sweet child, always so interested in colorful fabrics. And Caitlyn's thoughts on how Renly sure seems more interested in Loras than his new wife at dinner. He hardly looks at her. And of course, Stannis' comeback to Renly saying that he's got a hot maiden. Listen, man, in your bed, she's gonna stay a maiden. Get him, Stannis. He is my favorite goddamn Baratheon brother. The rest of Westeros treats Renly's preferences like an open secret anyway, culminating in one of the most memorable scenes in all of ASIAF to me personally. Are you a craven as well as a killer, Brienne? Is that why you ran with his blood on your hands? Draw your sword, woman. Best hope she doesn't. Jaime blocked his path again. Or it's like to be your corpse we carry out. The wench is as strong as Gregor Clegane, though not so pretty. This is no concern of yours. Sir Loras shoved him aside. Jaime grabbed the boy with his good hand and yanked him around. I am the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, you arrogant pup. Your commander so long as you wear that white cloak. Now sheathe your bloody sword, while I take it from you and shove it up someplace even Renly never found. I'm allowed to laugh at that, have my identification. Despite what you might think, I don't have a problem with this writing choice on principle. I don't feel that Renly is a caricature and Loras is repeatedly established to be a really competent fighter. He's ambitious and social in the story. Famously arrogant, Jaime doesn't balk at comparing himself to him or think of him as lesser. You know, so long as you understand that this is maybe not the end goal of gay representation and don't stand in the way of more explicit narratives, I believe it's totally okay to use this sort of silly, subdued 1980s style of bringing it up. And I hope I don't need to say that it is accurate to history. People have always been gay. With a cast this big, it's just statistics. Although that's never stopped fantasy authors in the past from excluding queerness completely, so thank you, Martin. I loved your spin on the tragic gays. At this year's Pride Parade, my minute of silence belongs to Renly Baratheon. There's some other side characters as well. Zaro Zoandaxus is pretty definitely gay. Laenor Velaryon is heavily implied to be by the Fire and Blood Chronicle. Brynden, the Blackfish Tully, another one of my favorites, objects to marriage completely for mysterious reasons. Oberyn Martell and the Dothraki collectively are said to bed with boys, although in both cases that's brought up as an insult and never confirmed. And of course, Satin of the Night's Watch, who is Jon Stewart when he becomes Lord Commander. These are all strong contenders for queer male characters in ASIAF. However, we have to keep in mind that none of their identity-determining activities are ever mentioned to be happening in any way, shape, or form. Seriously, from what I can remember, there isn't one mention of, oh yeah, they were doing it that they or those two had been kissing in secret then, or whatever. Martin's male queerness is so intangible, it doesn't warrant the conjugation of a verb. So the evidence for their queerness is so subtle that many people have been able to read the books and interpret it away completely. I don't believe Martin wrote it so elusively out of hatred, I really don't, but it is a choice he made. It's just the fact that he doesn't include it, even when it would arguably make sense to do so. Satin of the Night's Watch used to be a nighttime worker in Old Town. He shows up every now and again so somebody can comment on his past. Whenever that happens, there's a bit of a dramatic pause in which we all take a minute to grimly think on this before Jon gets to be like, whatever nasty, sickening, appalling shit Satin used to get up to, he said his vows, which just so qualifies him to microwave my food. We're in the fantasy equivalent of the Navy. And before you say, oh, but the Brothers of the Night's Watch sometimes visit Molestown, yeah, the guys at Castle Black, which is 1/3 of the Night's Watch, sometimes go to the nighttime workers in Molestown to spend... what money exactly? Oh, very occasionally the Black Brothers have contact with women, so does the real Navy. By rights, no one should be this freaked out by Satin having had nighttime with other men, especially not when it probably falls more under nighttime violence. months to years ago. I'll give Laenor a pass because Fire and Blood is written by an in-universe maester who wouldn't have swerved into his exploits, but just like his, Renly and Loras' relationship has an effect on succession politics. If either of them had verifiably fathered heirs with their wives, that would have had a huge impact on people's attitudes towards them and their legitimacy. So why not show why that isn't happening? Other people have asked Martin that same question. According to The Guardian, this was one of his responses. I'm not going to do it just for the sake of doing it. If the plot lends itself to that, if one of my viewpoint characters is in a situation, then I'm not going to shy away from it, but you can't just insert things because everyone wants to see them. I know you're joking. I know you're joking because you're also the guy whose plot lends itself to 214 instances of extreme nighttime violence. What the fuck are you talking about? I can't write it just for the sake of writing it. Also, please ignore the gay sex my female characters have on page. It's of no consequence to anything, but I just had to include it. But let's be fair, let's consider another reason for why Martin is distributing the attention of his narrative like this. Maybe there is an explanation. We know that gay men in Westeros, just like in history, have had to be extremely discreet, so obviously their subtlety would have had an impact on what the reader sees of their private lives. That's a convincing argument, right? Well, not for Asayaf, because since when has something being hidden ever been a reason for the reader not to be privy to it? We see characters commit adultery, assault, incest over the dead body of their sadistic incest child. Magic? MLM action isn't well liked in Westeros. Well, neither is grotesque Pavlovian torture, but here we are. It's also not a POV issue. I've heard it said that Martin just can't incorporate certain scenes because he's limited by the perspectives he's writing from, but that's some royal BS if I've ever heard it. With all due respect, he's not barred from writing about characters who have information the reader is not supposed to be privy to. That worked just fine in Book 1. Martin isn't at the mercy of some rigid constraints. He chooses which eyes to write from. Remember Chet, Merritt Frey, and Voromir Sixskins, the side characters that are alive for one chapter each and all have colorful tales of nighttime? Well, this is going to turn out to be a theme. From Feast onward, we have 8 random new point of view characters in actual chapters, 2 of whom die just so quickly. How is this system a limitation against writing male gay characters? Martin could have just given Renly 2 or 3 chapters. Killing him off after that would have been a prototypical plot beat for him. Listen, I like Hota, but what makes him more deserving of a POV than Oberyn? If I have to sit through Victorian and Aaron Greyjoy dicking around saltwater being delusional, you could have endured one scene of no homo lip contact. Not showing that? I don't know. Seems a bit dishonest to me. Don't you want to take us there, George? Especially when we know that there's at least a few men to choose from and that female characters who don't seem to have regular interest in other women still have gay sex on page. Sansa's friends at court are set to make out with each other, and I guarantee that that wasn't narratively important. I feel like specifying again what my aim here is. I'm not demanding Martin include 10-page man-on-man nighttime in his writing. I mean, especially not if he writes it anything like his straight scenes. I think even I could go without that, and let's just say I knew where to find this. I also don't think every person on the planet has a moral obligation to like gay sex in their books. This is a bit of a take of mine, so kindly keep it between you and me, but if you don't enjoy a certain kind of relationship constellation, you're free to avoid it in media, you know. As long as you don't talk shit about it, let it affect your politics or the way you treat queer people in real life, nobody can hold a gun to your head and make you have good taste. More for me. But if you bother to compare the 2 story elements Martin introduces that are considered morally opposed in Westeros while also being a historically accurate part of the story, you'll soon notice how selective he is about portraying them. Because, as I said, I don't mind his representation of queer people, but the contrast it creates is just too stark not to bring up here. If one element can exist solely in a shadow world of careful implications and insults and off-page backstory maybe, while the other needs 214 instances, the attention-paying reader asks themselves, why? The cynical conclusion to draw is that Martin doesn't care as much about being honest as he claims, and instead includes nighttime violence against women as a polarizing element that he and his target audience are more comfortable with than two consenting adult men being together. Or adult men by ASEAF standard, you know what I mean. That may not be your interpretation. Maybe you choose to cut him more slack here, but even if we say that Martin isn't dodging a topic he personally finds icky in his writing, he's still using honesty as an explanation for his choices. And honesty is a moral standard. You can't argue with honesty, therefore you can't argue with him. But Martin's honesty, quite objectively, produces some things and fails to produce others. So, in as little time as
an hour or so,
we have deconstructed the ways in which Martin frames his narrative. Because no matter the film, the director still has control over the tone, the camera, and where it's pointed. And if you don't actively choose to excuse them, these choices do not indicate genuine concern for authenticity. We don't need to be reminded that female characters have breasts. We don't need to see them be put in situations, and if we ever feel that we'd like to, we know where to turn, and it's not mass market fantasy fiction. I don't know about you, but I feel pretty confident in saying that there were many ways Martin could have easily avoided all these criticisms without compromising his values. Those being, women were treated like shit and no one's gonna forget about that on my watch. He's my inspiration for real. And in a way, I do mean that. Because as much as the camera is clearly compromised, the film may yet have something important to say. A lot of people I know believe in depicting more egalitarian-leaning societies in fantasy, even when the setting is based on real-life patriarchal ones. And I understand this. I don't think it's wrong or cowardly to imagine a world in which things that don't need to exist don't exist. There's a lot of great stories out there that employ some flavor of non-historical equality in their world building, and I do fuck with that, but there's also value in keeping history alive in stories. Martin seems to think so too.
You always get the scene where the spunky peasant girl tells off the arrogant lord. The spunky peasant girl who told off a real arrogant lord in like 1223 would have had her head chopped off, or at least her tongue ripped out.
I am 100% on Martin's side here. I'm not a fan of authors copy and pasting the vague idea of medieval European social structures into their writing, but having specific female characters they deem interesting or special enough, totally unaffected by them. The worst version of this is a female character who shows open hostility to women who conform to their roles, as if they're to blame for living in a society. It just feels deeply lazy, like an author wants to say something about past gender roles, but would rather have a character who rejects all of them always, and we never have to have a deeper conversation about this topic. It also understates the effort it takes to go against social expectations when they're all you've ever known. Like, an ambitious and competent woman in 18 whatever the fuck would probably make it her mission to secure an advantageous marriage that provided her with freedom and financial security, rather than randomly decide to overthrow gender roles, an endeavor that would have seemed close to impossible. One book series that maneuvers this really well is the Burning Kingdoms trilogy by Tasha Suri. The two books out in that series at time of recording are just dizzyingly high on my current list of all-time favorite fantasy books, and they show women maneuvering a deeply misogynistic world. The point is, I agree with Martin when he says that erasing history is wrong. We need to show reality sometimes, even in fantasy. We can't let people forget the things that George R.R. Martin has clearly drawn inspiration from, like the awful customs of the Babylonian marriage market, which forced young women to sit in public and give their innocence to the first man who would pay for it, or the complete lack of sexual morals rampant in primitive and unsophisticated Eurasian nomadic cultures and Native Americans. So, at the wall that is historical accuracy, we come to a standstill, right? Martin includes unnecessary scenes. Martin does not include the fallout of these unnecessary scenes. Martin is scared of boys kissing. This is something he might choose to work on. But everything he does show is 100% fitting for the time. His historical accuracy is often received critically by sensitive readers, but ultimately necessary, and there is nothing to condemn about that. Nothing at all. Man, I'm gonna get death threats over this video. Historical accuracy is the #1 reason why critical conversations about Martin's writing are shut down. Any and all nighttime and related brutality are beyond reproach, because that's just what the world was like. There you have it. And it's not like there's not a kernel of truth in that. As uncomfortable and ugly women's experience of society can be today, as a rule, it was worse if we go back in time. This is especially true for nighttime workers, women who made a living selling their bodies. Not only was their life made constantly difficult by the nature of their occupation, but they were also often social outcasts, regarded as fallen women whose foulness was socially contagious. There were those who had it better, as there always are. Martin represents this social caste of nighttime workers through Shae, the woman Tyrion keeps hidden in King's Landing throughout Clash and Storm. Side note, there was gonna be a chapter here about how much I hate Shae and how she's a horribly constructed character, but it's 2 in the morning. Martin's female characters have been shat on quite enough, but while Shae's life was relatively okay in some ways, the overwhelming majority of nighttime workers, both in history and Westeros, never achieved a fraction of her security. Let's all keep that in mind. Should be easy, as Martin is especially honest about this one. Being a nighttime worker was shit. I'm aware of movements that argue for the profession, but those are modern conversations that largely aim to create a safer and more dignified environment for workers today. Nothing of the sort existed in the Middle Ages, at least not to my knowledge. So imagine my surprise when I came across this scene in Clash, when Tyrion speaks to a pillow house owner in the city. Does she come from your homelands, this girl? Her blood is the blood of summer, my lord, but my daughter was born here in King's Landing. His surprise must have shown on his face, for Shataya continued, My people hold that there is no shame to be found in the pillow house. In the Summer Isles, those who are skilled at giving pleasure are greatly esteemed. Many highborn youths and maidens serve for a few years after their flowerings to honor the gods. Ma'am, you're not on the Summer Isles, and you've been in Westeros long enough to become a business owner. You should be well aware of how people of this profession are treated here. Shatayas may be a bit of an upscale place, as the wiki puts it, but that doesn't mean that nighttime work is without danger there. In fact, people with influence making up your customer base practically guarantees that anyone who does pull something shady will get away without consequences. And guess what happens to Shatayas' daughter in the story? Nothing nice, that's for sure, but she's not the sort of person whose mistreatment would elicit sympathy or legal action because, again, shit profession that people looked down upon. The complaint of this absolutely nonsensical world-building element is complicated by the fact that this is supposed to be a cultural practice. So Shataya came to Westeros and decided that her daughter should keep the old ways, which entails young people being expected to serve for a time in temples of love. Right. It's not entirely unrealistic for a society to be more sex positive than medieval Europe. In fact, the more I think about it, the easier it gets. So, in theory, all we'd need to do in order to verify a real historical basis for this is find out which culture Martin based the Summer Isles on and check whether that's what their practices looked like. But when I set out to do this, I quickly ran into a huge problem. I could recall basically no other points of reference for the Summer Isles except this, and it unnerved me. I began to seriously question my own memories. You see, by the time I started Storm, I was already planning on making this video, meaning I had been looking for things to talk about as I was reading. I suddenly became vigilant to the possibility that I had somehow overread most of the productive non-Westerosi world building and focused on things that stood out to me as weird. This would have been a huge oversight on my part and really embarrassing, so just to be sure that my hammer hadn't turned Martin's writing into nails, I consulted the wiki. And yeah, apparently I missed a ton of stuff. The Summer Isles have a really interesting three-dimensional history to them. Martin made sure to give this place the attention it deserves. Or did he? If you check the sources the wiki cites for its claims, you'll soon notice that maybe Martin didn't bother too much with the Summer Isles, at least not in Asayath. An overwhelming majority of information, you see, does not come to us from any of the 5 books, but from supplementary material, like interviews and The World of Ice and Fire, a companion volume the wiki refers to as a semi-canon source. The supplementary stuff makes up, including but not limited to, all of history, all of geography, and all of its 2 major historical periods, the Age of Exploration and the Slavers' War. Even more unsettling is the fact that if you're scraping the bottom of the lore barrel, which the wiki for the Summer Isles most definitely does, you're gonna have to include any details you get, which means that from the 25 lines that include any information from the actual series versus the 77 lines that don't, 8 of them are nighttime related, meaning that a third of all information we have about this culture is how they get nasty. If you consider that most of the rest is descriptions of clothing, cuisine, accents, and the parade of words Martin uses to describe skin colors, this sort of puts into perspective what he chose to focus on. Like, I know that the story doesn't take place on the Summer Isles and that we don't have a POV by anyone who's from there, which is why if Martin simply didn't include a lot of info, I wouldn't feel the need to question this, but he did. He clearly did. He just included specific kinds of information for the sole purpose of having a mother offer up her daughter to a protagonist, seemingly, and then having someone pressure Sam into getting a girlfriend. And I don't want to dismiss this world building out of hand. I mean, at the end of the day, these love temples and the culture that surrounds them don't sound morally wrong. Or bad. You're all in college, right? But in the form that they appear in the lore, they are at least unrealistic. I can't prove that they weren't a thing somewhere in the world. There's a lot of theories out there as to what the Summer Isles may be based on, although one issue here is that even if I could find an island nation that ever sported a similar practice, the source may not be reliable. Hypersexualization is a common colonizer's bias. Well, I guess there's one thing that comes to mind. Do you remember the Babylonian marriage market? The concept seems similar, and another scene in dance seems to allude to a Milanese custom based on it too. There's only one minor issue with letting yourself be inspired by it, which is the Babylonian marriage market did not exist. The suggestion that it did comes to us from, let's say, not always airtight Herodotus, and is neither supported by reliable ancient sources, Babylonian sources, or modern scholars. It's true that the goddess Ishtar was worshipped in Babylon, and she may have connected her priestesses to nighttime work somehow, but this was definitely never applied to big numbers of people by default. Do you know how I know that? Because it's logistically impossible. A rite like this would require nighttime to be mostly stripped of intimacy on the Summer Isles, and not just to the point of destigmatization. If you expect your population to do this in their youth, what do you do with people who are just uncomfortable with that? Are they cast out? Or does the social construction of nighttime do away with the idea that it's something special? Does this society not have any concept of virginity? equality at all? Is it fully egalitarian? I thought we couldn't do that. Do STDs not exist on the Summer Isles? Have they mastered contraceptives? The utopian dreams of a hippie are somewhat curbed if we don't have modern medicine or sexual liberation. This system implies a lot about a culture, George. Why do I get the feeling that you weren't thinking about it that hard when you wrote this? Another non-Seven Kingdoms group that's easily scrutinized here are the wildlings, or the free folk as they call themselves. The way that wildlings marry is that they basically kidnap women, just on principle. I'm not going to pretend here that that's not a thing that happened. Martin is correct in saying that war is and always has been especially harsh on women. We've already discussed how Martin doesn't stick to war times at all, but this also happened on raids. That's well attested in the cultures the wildlings are probably based on, and others, unfortunately. Fine. Now, what Martin does here is put an interesting spin on this. Mainly that the wildlings capture the women of not enemies. It seems to be common practice to carry away a wife for yourself, even if you're on good terms with her friends and family and don't mean to change that, which, as far as I can tell, was never really the norm anywhere. Apparently, people generally weren't fans of this happening to their daughters, can't imagine why, but this does raise some questions, no? Because the wildlings don't seem to have marriage as an institution. Taking someone for a wife doesn't entail more than the kidnapping. There's no wedding reliably signaling the beginning of a formal and binding commitment to have her live in your household. I know that this is blunt, but it is why the institution of marriage used to exist. If you treat women as property, you need laws to make sure your property isn't being stolen willy-nilly without consequences. If you've ever wondered, this is also why some very dedicated feminists are against marriage. I believe you can have a wedding or a lawful partnership without these implications, especially in a society in which women are financially independent. I know I want a big wedding and I want a big white dress, but that is where weddings come from. It's ownership of a woman passing from a father to a husband. As shitty as that was and still is for women, at least that bond comes with very specific duties for a husband. And these are important when you can't support yourself. If you don't have that, but your society isn't egalitarian either, which we can hopefully agree the wildlings are not, despite the spearwives, this creates problems in the logic of your world. We're told that a man who wants to carry a woman off has to outsmart or outfight her and her family, and if he fails, he gets the shit beaten out of him. How is this normalized? Who enjoys this? Why, in a community that gets along peacefully, would any other custom not immediately replace this? And you might say, but that's just how it's described. It sounds ugly, but it might be much less brutal in practice. It's a tradition, probably more play pretend like the bedding in the Seven Kingdoms. Well, I hate to say, the books give us no reason to assume that. The two carrying aways that are described to us in more detail are that of Ygritte and Tormund, who's telling a joke about accidentally spending nighttime with a bear when he was drunk. Both cases are violent. Do these characters have their own reasons to exaggerate? Sure, but if all we have to go off of are putting up a fight and killing her colleagues in their sleep and capturing her at sword point, and the only chill wildling wedding we see is actually a mixture of the Lord of Lights and Westerosi customs, on what canon basis would we assume that they're usually more peaceful? Their customs are specifically really loose and not state enforced, which also means that there's nothing preventing these unions from going sour without state intervention. In Storm, Jon criticizes wildling marriage, saying that a man might be cruel or a drunk or he might beat his wife. And Ygritte delivers the brilliant rebuttal that a man clever and strong enough to kidnap her would automatically be cool. obviously, and a woman can just kill a guy who is mean to her. A man can own a woman or a man can own a knife, but no man can own both. Wow, Martin's at it again with the women's rights activism. I wholeheartedly support this outlook. Don't get me wrong, domestic abuse is extremely serious and the gloves should come off when we're dealing with perpetrators. But to teach women they should just stab their partner is not gonna solve the problem. I mean, to assume that any woman will be capable of taking a life when she's in danger is already unrealistic, just like not every man would be capable of that. But even if the free folk girls are just built different or whatever, this type of world building still shows inherent misunderstanding of how domestic abuse works. Because just kill him will eventually not be an option, in the same way that just leave him often isn't. One of the biggest reasons for why domestic abuse is so dangerous is that women often have no choice but to stay in the relationship due to fear, dependence, or a child. Add to that the fact that there is no institution saying a husband needs to provide for or be nice to or even keep his wife around, and you have the perfect recipe for George, this idea was piss. If a wildling steals a woman and manages to behave passably just long enough to return her to his community, any and all female agency that you could interpret into that practice if you wanted vanishes. Because she's in his community now, surrounded by his family who will likely support him and not her. If she stabs him, I don't know if you've noticed, but our society already doesn't support women who just report this kind of stuff happening. Does Martin really think that the guy's brothers or friends or whatever would realize that she knifed him and go, yeah, girl power? Also, I hate to infringe upon Martin's innocence and gentle heart here, but there are ways of owning both a woman and a knife. In fact, in the very book all of this is established in, we get chapters of Arya traveling around with the Hound, who ties her into her blanket every night so she can keep trying to extend his nap. I don't want to plant images of what could have been happening here in your mind, but I hope you understand now how this is a pretty wonky feature to include in your world building. Less generous readers might get the impression that Martin did not stop to consider any of this, but chose to randomly focus on a culture's nighttime again, which he also arbitrarily exotified and made violent. I'm beginning to sense a theme, especially since there's another group outside the Seven Kingdoms we get to know, the Dothraki, whose culture and nighttime practices in particular seem like they're pulled straight out of a horse's ass. For this segment, I consulted a series of absolutely fascinating posts by expert on Mediterranean economies and militaries and major nerd Dr. Brett Devereaux. In 2022, he published an in-depth analysis of Martin's Dothraki in 4 parts. He does focus on the show when it comes to visual interpretations of clothing and culture, but he refers back to Asayaf when he determines that what Martin wrote often has no basis in reality at all. I was really interested in what he has to say about the lack of art and cultural diversity in the hordes. For example, he points out that the Dothraki Sea stretches across the size of about 6 Westerosi kingdoms, but seems to have a weirdly homogenous culture altogether, whereas Westeros differentiates heavily between the culture of even minor noble houses and geographical areas. Devereaux also describes how disconnected the Dothraki's bluntness is in general from the actual nomadic cultures Martin has stated they're based on.
Primitive and unsophisticated Eurasian nomadic cultures and Native American.
Oops. Shockingly enough, Mongols and Sioux have always engaged in art, storytelling, and music. In regards to the Dothraki's weird focus on violent nighttime, as well as the defense of historical accuracy, Devereaux has this to say. The idea advanced by Martin that the truly stunning amount of most of it not in the context of war, in A Song of Ice and Fire somehow reflects medieval social norms or a true vision of the past or particular cultures is to be rejected. Needless to say, it is not considered okay to just begin dancing women in either Great Plains Native American or Mongol cultures. This is so refreshing! Finally someone who actually read the damn thing! I was beginning to think I was the only one. As we spend more time in Meereen, Essos is slightly more fleshed out by Martin, but literally all of it is still really vague compared to what we've seen from him. The further we get from Europe land, the more details seem to tighten around nighttime-y cultural practices. What sparse information we do get is completely isolated from a society that may or may not begin to make sense of it with context. And a great majority of these societies' nighttime customs are just not rooted in history. From where I'm standing, we can come to one of two conclusions here. Either Martin was fully aware that what he was writing was not historically accurate, meaning that he chose to crank up the nighttime-liness of these cultures to 11 because he wanted to do with that what you will, or, without doing Wikipedia levels of research, Martin assumed that the cultures he was loosely referencing were just like that. Neither of those sounds great, and whichever you choose to believe in, it reliably puts a scholarly bullet into the historical accuracy argument. I've heard people say that maybe this is deliberate, and Martin is doing very clever social commentary actually, but how can that be when the stereotypes he does include explicitly, i.e. Dornish or Mirish women are all wanton, are basically proven correct? The women from those places we get to know better, mainly Princess Arianne, Alaria Sand, and Taina Merryweather, are just chronically happy people. She found a cedar chest full of her clothes at the foot of her bed, so she stripped out of the travel-stained garb she had slept in and donned the most revealing garments she could find. Wisps of silk that covered everything and hid nothing. Prince Doran, that's her dad, might treat her like a child, but she refused to dress like one. She knew such garb would discomfort her father when he came to chastise her for making off with Myrcella. Brilliant plan, Arianne. This is why you're the heir to Sunspear, and not your brother who nobody liked. Quentin, you were taken from us too soon. All three of these women are very nighttime-y. In basically anything they do, they're also united in their mission to fuck Cersei. Interestingly enough, be that as it may, I don't personally feel like they work as commentaries on how women of color are sexualized in media and the world. I'm no expert on racial representation in Asiaf or anywhere else for that matter. I'm sure there's many people with lived experience who have different thoughts on this, and obviously I'd urge you to listen to them instead of me when it comes to approaching the ahistorical aspects of people of color in the books. But there are a few things that I am pretty sure of after having done research for this video, which is that Martin's reputation as a man who tells it how it is and bravely showcases reality in today's media landscape is a bold-faced lie. In a lot of ways, the scale of Martin's writing is inspiring. It's an advantage to stretch the wings of fantasy across so many places, so many cultures, and it honestly bothers me that he seems not to have recognized the responsibility nor the opportunity here. Remember how we talked about stories influencing us? Well, I think we can safely say that sane people with hobbies, especially sane show watchers with hobbies, won't look into whether or not Martin has done the work to represent historical social structures. I mean, the guy prides himself on being historically accurate, and everyone else prides him on it too. So we run the risk of having people assume that shit like this is or was real in some way, that the societies Martin mentions or even visually borrows from do things like this. Of course, we all know it's fantasy, and that does give writers some leeway, but it won't stop this effect. Monkey see, monkey reinforce existing racial stereotypes by recognizing aesthetic choices associated with them. People claim so often that Martin is a pioneer of fantasy, that his books are so vast and brilliant that they couldn't possibly not speak to someone, that if you don't enjoy them, you just don't get it. And while I genuinely believe that anyone can enjoy the best parts of Asiaf, the suspense, the scale of the world, the drama, Quentin. I also wouldn't blame anyone for saying that the books weren't for them because of what we've discussed so far. From the beginning, I knew this video was going to ruffle some feathers. I'm by no means the first person to notice the more glaringly questionable world-building choices or the way women are described, but it's because I really enjoyed reading these books that it bothered me so much. Whenever I talked to my script consultants for this video, they were more lenient with Martin than I was. They did debate me out of including some things. I consider them a practice round for you lot, so big thank you to Tororen, Bear, and Kay, who gave me the kind of support only a non-sane ACF fan could. You have my eternal respect, I love you. But even if you are a stalwart fan and did disagree with me on the points that allow for disagreement, let me ask you this. When you recommend ACF to your friends, your family, or people online, is it this you tell them about? Is this your pitch? Do you genuinely believe that the books would suffer from losing this? Or is there a possibility that behind that gut reaction discomfort, all you're feeling is panic, that a space you value is being invaded, that something you're used to might eventually change? As much as I like to joke about whiny nerds, I'd be lying if I said I didn't understand them. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't one myself. No, you don't get it. The stuff that came out when I was a teenager is just objectively the best. Humanity peaked with Clone Wars and Warrior Cats. I believe there's great value in investing time in and seeking to understand stories. I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't. There's so much value in a world as vast and beautiful as the one Martin created. I've rarely felt so immersed in another book series, given so much of a shit about things that didn't happen centuries before the things that didn't happen more recently. I don't remember which book it's from. It might have been Feast, but there's this one small scene I feel encompasses all of this really well. Sam is talking to Jon, and they've just figured out that Valyrian steel can kill whites, and Jon has this whole overblown reaction of, oh, great, we'll just politely ask the houses to give up their Valyrian steel to us. It's really subtle how much build-up it took to get to this point, to understand and fully appreciate the sarcasm, the value that Valyrian house swords have to the noble families of the realm, how emblematic it is of the struggle the Night's Watch is facing. The Seven Kingdoms too wrapped up in petty shit to give up their cool swords to the fight against chilly zombies. You're on Jon's side here, but you also understand the personal stakes every other character has in the struggle for the Iron Throne. You feel this entire interaction down to your bones. You're involved, like you're being told an inside joke. That's what ASIAF at its best can be, a world that never ends. Maybe literally, but until it either does or doesn't, it can take you on an incredible journey. And I simply see no reason for why it shouldn't invite along some people as much as it does others. And honestly, if you seriously consider yourself a fan and supporter of Martin and his works, I can't see why you wouldn't agree here. Don't we want the things we love to reach their full potential? I have mentioned issues in this video that are not mine to forgive, but if the people who were affected most by them decide that it is faith we need rather than punishment, I'd understand that. I imagine that if you've achieved success on such a stratospheric level, it's difficult to receive critique. How do you distinguish between the people who are trying to genuinely communicate discomfort that could have been avoided and those who feel the need to take a stance against something popular they haven't involved themselves with at all? People who are unintentionally blind to other people's perspective and praise the books with pure intentions, from incel bootlickers who are abusing an artistic argument to be mean to women and minorities. How do you deal with that? And if you do pick out reasonable criticism, how do you change tracks decades into your career? I wouldn't know. Improvement may have to be more guided than enforced. Today, I did not do that. If Martin changes his ways, it won't be because of this. I made fun of him a lot. But just as it wasn't my intention to cancel him, I don't see it as my duty to give him grace. It's no one's responsibility to defend or even tolerate Martin's creative choices, no matter where you stand. And I hope that the next time you engage in this nightmarish discussion, you will be better armed with what I could provide. Either an in-depth knowledge of what the grievance actually is, or a link to an hour-long video to occupy the next motherfucker who thinks historical accuracy is a reasonable excuse for being a dick. That was a joke. Don't send this video to rude people.